Welcome back to this series from Walk Through the Bible Study Simplified. This is session 3, Explain, Understanding the Meaning of a Bible Passage. Maybe you've been in this situation before. You're in a small group, a Bible study group, and the leader opens up their Bible and they read a passage, and then they ask this question. Well, what does that mean to you? I cringe every time I hear that question. I know it's well-intentioned and probably means something like, how does that passage apply to your life? But that question, what does it mean to you, is a little bit of a dangerous one. Here's why. The goal of Bible study is not really to understand what does the passage mean to me. God is the author, the ultimate author of the Bible. God wrote a book, and He wrote this book to give to you and to me, and He had something to say. God had a purpose, God had an intention, God had a meaning, and the goal of Bible study is not to ask, what does the passage mean to me, but rather to ask, what did God mean? What does this passage mean to us? And that is the aim of this third session. Remember, we said there's a process that we're trying to outline, a recipe for learning to study the Bible on our own in this series. We said we start with read. We read big sections of the Bible to get the broad context in which the passage that we want to study is found. And then we get off of the high point, down into the valley, and look at all of the details. In session 2, explore, understanding what the passage is saying, exploring all of those details. The third step is to step back just a little bit and ask this question around, what does the passage mean? Explain, understanding the meaning of a Bible passage. You know, this is probably a good time to remind you that really throughout this entire process, but especially at this point, we should remain prayerfully dependent on God. You know, if you think about God as the author of this book, that He wrote these words to you. And if we come to God and we say, God, would you guide me? Would you, through your Spirit, direct me to understand clearly what it is that you are trying to say to me? Now, I believe that is a prayer that God is anxious to answer. And you know, it's also a good time to remember that when we come to study the Bible, we bring a lot of things with us. Our background, our experiences, our agendas, our preferences, things that we've been taught or heard in the past, all of that sort of makes up who we are, we bring that to the Bible. And it's not possible to completely set that aside, but we have to remain open-minded when we come to try to understand the meaning of a Bible passage. Try as best that we can to set aside our own agendas, our own preferences, our own thinking, and say, God, what are you trying to say here? So how do we do that? Well, in this series, we want to keep things super simple for you, a clear plan or process to follow. And so here's how we're going to try to explain the meaning of the Bible passage. In the study guide, if you go to walkthrough.org/simplified and download the template or the study guide, in this session, we begin 5 different statements. 5 statements that begin, and then we are going to encourage you to just finish those statements. And as you try to articulate an answer to finish those statements, you'll begin to think through the meaning of the Bible passage. So the first statement starts this way. This passage teaches me that God, and then try to finish that statement. What we're after in this statement is really understanding what is God revealing about Himself to us in the passage that we're trying to study. That's a really important thing to learn. God chose this book, the Bible, as the primary way in which He reveals Himself to us. And so as we're trying to understand the meaning of the passage that we want to study, that seems like a really, really good place to start. This passage teaches me that God, and then try to answer or finish that statement. We're using Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 as sort of a sample in this series. By now we've been reading the book of Philippians. We spent a lot of time exploring the details of this passage in our second session, and now we're going to step back and try to explain the meaning. And so I had this idea. This passage teaches me that God, there's really two ways that I actually completed that statement, and that's okay. I said God places a high value on humility because Jesus modeled it when he came to earth as a servant and died on the cross. We've been reading Philippians 2, 1 through 13, and that's a big thing that I think we learn about God, that he values humility because Jesus modeled it when he came to earth and died. And then I wrote a second statement, and you can write two or three if necessary. I just said this passage teaches me that God or Jesus is supremely exalted and every knee will bow down worshiping him. That's a really important truth to learn about God, isn't it? That Jesus is exalted and one day every knee is going to bow and worship him. That's how I answered or finished that first statement. The second statement that you'll finish is this. The author wrote this in order, and then how would you finish that statement? The author wrote this in order to. And again, we're trying to understand what was the author trying to say? And what was the purpose of this? What was the meaning of this in its original context? So in Philippians, in our example here, Paul, in prison, writing this letter to the Philippian Christians, and he used these 13 verses to do something, to communicate something, to encourage something. What was that? And so we want to just take a few minutes and we want to step back. We're going to linger here for just a little bit and try to understand, why did the author write this? So as I was trying to think through this, I actually just sort of wrote down, the author wrote this in order to, and then I just wrote there was a problem and some conflict. There was a solution to be like-minded, to have the same love, to be one in spirit. And then there was this motivation that we think of others the way that Jesus thought of us. I was just making notes, and that's a good way to sort of work through this process. Just make notes, write ideas, write things down. And then but I wanted to focus that, and so I turned that into a sentence. The author wrote this in order to correct any potential conflict in the church by encouraging oneness, by appealing to Jesus. There's no perfect answer to this. And your statement, if you were doing this in Philippians 2, might sound very, very different. But the idea is to try to understand what was happening in the mind of the author as he wrote this, and how does that ultimately impact the way in which we understand or interpret the passage. The third statement, the hardest part of understanding the meaning of the passage is. And here again, we're just going to acknowledge that sometimes when we do Bible study, especially when we get to this stage of trying to explain the meaning of a Bible passage, there are going to be things that we don't know. There are going to be things that are confusing. There are going to be things that that there are a variety of opinions about, and we just need to acknowledge that. And I think it's good for us to note that. It's good for us to write that down and just identify what those are. One of the things that I think is a really important explanation issue is this whole idea that we read in verse 12 and 13 earlier about working out our salvation. I just wrote the hardest part of understanding the meaning of the passage is to know what it means that we continue to work out our salvation. And then I just wrote even especially with the use of the word salvation. What does that mean? I just wrote that down as the hardest part for me. The fourth statement and the fifth statement are pretty similar. The fourth statement, you see it in the study guide. This passage teaches me about my relationship with God, and then finish the statement. What are you learning about your relationship with God in this passage? We're not quite to the state of trying to apply it to our life. We're just trying to understand what is meant by this passage as it relates to our relationship with God. I wrote, this passage teaches me about my relationship with God, the depth of His love that Jesus would give up so much in order to die on the cross. And as I read this, I just was overwhelmed with how much God must love you and me that He would send His Son to die. And then the fifth statement, this passage teaches me about my relationship with others. All I did is I just wrote, unity matters. And your answers in these questions can be that simple. I just was reflecting, what does this passage teach me about my relationship with others? And that's how I answered it. Unity matters. This part of the process is just trying to explain and understand the meaning of the passage. Now, there's one final step, and this is a really important step in this process. And in fact, out of all 4 of these sessions, this next part may be the most difficult thing that I'm going to ask you to do. But I think it's so helpful. So by now, we've been reading and we've been answering some questions. We've been exploring. We've got notes and all sorts of details written down. And then we tried to complete these statements to explain the meaning of the passage. And this is a point at which, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. To write a single sentence that explains the meaning of the passage that you were studying. So you went through all of these different statements, looking at different elements or aspects of trying to understand the meaning of the passage. And now we're going to write one sentence that we think best summarizes the meaning of the passage. Now, here's why we do that. This exercise will force you to focus all of your efforts and pull together all of these different ideas into a single thought. The sentence that I wrote was something like this: Jesus' willingness to deny Himself for our salvation motivates us to pursue unity through humility by denying ourselves. That's how I answered that question. Again, your sentence may sound very different, but how would you summarize the passage that you are studying in a single sentence to best explain its meaning? And that's it. That's the next step in this process. Read, explore, explain, understanding the meaning of the Bible passage. In our final session, we'll begin to ask the question, how does that apply to my life? See you in session 4.